continuing our discussion of known evolutionary mechanisms. So we've already talked about a few. Discussed mutation, which is really kind of the ultimate driver of slow, steady evolutionary change, just constant alteration of genes in the genome. We talked about gene flow, which comes from individuals moving from one population to a next and taking their genes with them. Um, that can be beneficial or detrimental to those populations and their evolution, depending on what the genes are that are flowing, that are moving. We discussed genetic drift, and in particular, two mechanisms: the bottleneck effect and the founder effect. Uh, Both of those mechanisms basically almost always have a deleterious effect on the population and their long term survival by reducing diversity. And now that brings us to the last two: non random mating and natural selection. And non random mating, just as that name implies, is the situation where individuals within a population are choosy about who they're going to mate with. So if you imagine a situation where there was just total random mating, in that kind of scenario, basically anybody who survived would have an equal chance of passing on their genes. And remember, evolution is all about not only survival, but right, passing your genetic material on to the next generation. So in these situations where mating is not random, individuals that are more successful at mating are obviously going to uh, pass their genes on and their particular phenotypes along within that population. And this can have a really dramatic and, in some cases, very rapid effect on the genetic diversity of a population. In particular, this is maybe most obvious in situations where you have what's called sexual selection, which is a specific and very common form of non random mating, where typically the female of a species is very choosy about which male they're going to reproduce with. And they might be looking for some very specific either phenotype, right, appearance, or maybe behavior in the male. This is very common in birds, where in many cases it will drive these very dramatic phenotypic differences between male and female. So here you have a peahen that's relatively plain looking versus peacock, right? It has this incredible display of feathers and colors. And this is all due to sexual selection because the female is going to choose the male that has the biggest, brightest display to reproduce with. Now, the last mechanism is one that we already touched on in the first half of the chapter, which was natural selection. And, hopefully you feel comfortable with that idea. But just to remind you, right, natural selection is the idea that the natural environment is difficult to survive in. There's lots of challenges in terms of evading predators, finding food, finding shelter, and not to mention finding a mate and reproducing and getting your offspring to reproductive age. So you have all these challenges, and only those individuals that are best suited to survive in their particular environment are going to be able to pass their genes along. So the natural environment is selecting for the fittest individuals. And when we say fitness, right, we're not talking about physical fitness in terms of who can run the fastest or lift the most weights. We're talking biological fitness, which is all about survival and reproduction. So you would be considered more biologically fit if you are able to produce more offspring and get those offspring to reproductive age. That's ensuring the survival of your genes, essentially. Um, and so, of course, in a natural setting, you're going to have changes within a diverse natural population of the frequency of specific genes or specific alleles, right, versions of individual genes. And so geneticists can measure those allele frequencies and actually observe the evolution of populations at the genetic level, even in the wild. So I wanted to point out a few specific types of natural selection that all apply to characters that vary quantitatively. So this would not apply to qualitative characters. So think something like Mendel's flower color in his peas, right? They were either purple or white. You just had those two possibilities. But there are lots of characters that vary quantitatively, meaning there's lots of different possible phenotypes. So think something like height or weight. So if you were to measure the height of, all the students at Pitt State, you would probably get a bell curve, something like this, right, where the majority of individuals are an average height here in the middle. So we have a higher frequency of that average height. And as we either go towards very tall or very short, right, we're getting fewer and fewer people. So you get that bell curve distribution. So the three types of natural selection I want to talk about all apply to these types of characters and these types of distributions. And they're listed here, what are called stabilizing, directional, or disruptive selection. And I'll go through just examples of each of these briefly. So stabilizing selection is going to be natural selection that preserves that bell curve distribution and that average phenotype. And kind of the classic example of that would be what we see with human birth weight, which has remained in the, get this bell curve distribution again. Average human birth weight has been, somewhere around 7 pounds, maybe just under 7 pounds for many, many, many years. And if we think of this in terms of natural selection, the reason for that becomes pretty obvious, because if you are born at that mean or average birth weight, you're going to have the highest optimal chance of survival, right? Whereas if you are born at a lower birth weight, that puts you at risk in terms of certain, you know, health risk in terms of certain very potentially serious complications. If you're born at a very high birth weight, right, that presents its own risks, especially in terms of complications during the birth or delivery itself, right, may put the mother and the child's survival at risk. So it's an advantage to be an average weight baby, right? You're more likely to survive. So that is going to help preserve that bell curve over time. In directional selection, you're seeing selection for individuals at either one extreme of the bell curve or the other. So in this case, the particular trait we're looking at is horn length in cattle, Texas Longhorn cattle in particular. And through this phenomenon of directional selection, we've ended up with these cattle where the males have these extremely long horns, right? And it's believed just simple predation was the selective pressure in this case. So, you know, lots of things that would like to eat the cattle, and if you have longer, scarier, more intimidating horns, right? Uh, Predators are going to be less likely to attack, and you may be more able to fend them off if you are attacked. So that's going to increase survival, and it's pushing that distribution towards the extreme end. So away from the average in this case. And in disruptive selection, you're selecting for individuals at typically both extremes of the bell curve. So again, against the average, but instead of just driving it towards one extreme or the other, individuals at both ends of the bell curve are going to do better than those in the middle. So we get this kind of bimodal distribution like you see here. And in this example, we're looking at beak or bill size in these birds called black-bellied seed crackers. And as that name would imply, they eat seeds, right? And So we think this distribution has been driven by the availability of seeds of specific sizes. So imagine you have population of these birds in an environment where large seeds and small seeds are very abundant. Um, so it turns out if you have an average size beak, you're actually not very well suited to be able to eat or obtain either the large seeds or the very small seeds, so you're less likely to survive. Whereas if you have a very small beak, right, if you're down here at this end of the distribution, you can very efficiently get these small soft seeds that are very readily available. Um, or if you have a very large beak, you can effectively crack open these big hard seeds that are also readily available. So it's just the natural environment, right? These particular plant species and the seeds they produce are driving the bill size in the bird population in this disruptive way. So, just two last points to make before we end the chapter here. So, one is that evolution is constrained. So, if you look around, you can see we've got this incredible diversity of life on planet Earth that has come through evolution. So, it can do many, many things and create many, many phenotypes and morphologies, but there are some limits. So, first and foremost, evolution is constrained by the genetic variation that exists within a population. So, yeah, we can get some new traits and characters through mutation, um, but that, as we've discussed, is going to be typically pretty slow, steady, usually fairly minimal change. Um, so we're limited by the genetic variation that exists. And of course, evolution also has to be limited by certain physical laws and realities. So, we have to follow the laws of thermodynamics. We have to follow the laws that govern the protein folding and bond formation between amino acids. Um, we have to maintain a small cell size for reasons that we talked about in earlier chapters. So, even though we can do lots of things through evolution, we're probably never going to evolve humans that can shoot laser beams out of their eyes, right? Because that is going to go against the laws of thermodynamics. So, many possibilities, but also some constraints for you to be aware of. And then lastly, um, I wanted to point out that evolutionary changes are never perfect. So, for any new trait that may appear through mutation, there's going to be both benefits and some costs that are likely associated with that new phenotype. And so it's really going to come down to this sort of cost benefit analysis in terms of natural selection and whether or not the benefits outweigh the costs. So, just to give you a specific example here, this guy in the upper right hand corner is a rough skinned newt, and it makes this neurotoxin as a defensive mechanism. So, anything that eats the rough skinned newt is going to basically become paralyzed. This toxin works by blocking these sodium channels on muscle cells and paralyzing the muscles. And so it turns out in areas where these newts live, there are some populations of garter snakes that have, just through random mutation, evolved resistance to that particular neurotoxin. So they can eat these newts that they previously did not have access to. Um, and so that's obviously a benefit, right? For these populations of snakes, now they can eat this newt that no other organisms can eat. Got a new food source that's probably going to uh, help their survival. But the cost, the trade off in this case, is that the mutation that gives these snakes resistance also causes their own muscles to fire and contract more slowly, so the snakes move more slowly, which of course may put them at greater risk of being eaten by their own predators, or may make it difficult to catch other fast moving food that they might be after. So there's a benefit, there's a cost, and really we just have to sit back and watch in terms of natural selection, right? If the benefits outweigh the cost in this particular example, then we will likely see that particular trait persist, right, and become more widespread in these populations of snakes. Whereas if the cost is too high, we will see those snakes die off and that trait disappear with them. So this cost benefit analysis is constantly happening in the natural world with any trait all the time. All right, so we will end chapter 19 there. Thanks for hanging with me, and I will talk to you next time.